Welcome. This is a PSR weekly webinar and also being double billed as a lavender lunch from the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies. I'm really privileged here to coordinate this conversation. And the idea for this topic, what does Christian ministry look like in this time of pandemic, comes from President David. He and I were talking a few weeks ago, and I was mentioning the fact that the three of the staff members of CLGS are Christian pastors, happen to be in three urban areas particularly hard hit by COVID-19, New York City, Detroit, and Tampa. I'd like to introduce each one of them and then start our discussion. And we only have an hour with one another, so we will have plenty of time for questions toward the end. So again, as David mentioned, my name is Bernie Schlager. I serve as Executive Director of CLGS here at Pacific School of Religion, and I'm also Associate Professor of Historical and Cultural Studies at PSR. And I also coordinate our Certificate of Sexuality and Religion, the CSR program. I'll make a plug for that at the end of today's presentation. So let me introduce to you three of our panelists, again, who are members of the staff of CLGS and also PSR. Reverend Jakob Hero Shaw. Jakob is Senior Pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church of Tampa. Jakob is on the faculty of the Transgender Seminary and Leadership Cohort and coordinates the Transgender Roundtable here at CLGS. And Jakob and his husband live in Tampa, Florida, with their two children. Second, I'd like to introduce Reverend Carla Roland Guzmán, who is the Latinx Roundtable Coordinator for CLGS. I should mention, by the way, Jakob is a graduate of CLGS, of PSR. And so as I reintroduce Carla Roland Guzmán, Carla is a graduate of the GTU and CDSP in 2001, and Reverend Guzmán is also Senior Pastor of a bilingual, multicultural, inclusive Episcopal congregation in New York City. And Carla has served this congregation in New York for over 15 years. They also teach church history at the General Theological Seminary in New York. And Reverend Guzmán is author of the recent book, Unmasking Latinx Ministry for Episcopalians, an Anglican Approach, which was released in February 2020. And then thirdly, Reverend Dr. Roland Stringfellow, who is Senior Pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church of Detroit and also works with congregations on LGBT inclusion as Director of Ministerial Outreach for our African American Roundtable program here at CLGS. Reverend Dr. Stringfellow has been consulted by media outlets regarding his work on marriage equality and religious liberty and the role people of color and communities of faith play in this national debate. So welcome to Jakob, to Carla, and to Roland. My first question to them, they've been prepared a bit in advance. I'd like to ask each of them what three words come to their minds as they think about Christian ministry in their own context in this time of pandemic, and then to follow those three words with a brief statement or reflection before we move on. So alphabetically, Jakob.
All right. So when I think of three words, I will start with napping, playing, and praying. So I am finding that I'm working longer hours and much harder than usual, and realized that with starting early and working till late at night, that I could carve out a little bit of a time for a nap since I am working from home. And at least 3 days a week, I get to have a nap, and that is the best self-care that I've had. I, as you mentioned, am the faculty for the Trans Seminary and Leadership Cohort, and that's a group of seminary students from across the country. And in our recent meeting, they asked if we could, instead of focusing on all the heavy stuff, if we could play instead. And we played Jackbox, which is like you can play online. And it's word games and things. And it was also some of the best self-care, just laughing together with these students and being playful. And of course, praying. This is a time that requires a lot of prayer and intentional focus.
Great, thank you, Jacob. Emily, if we could put the speakers' pictures up on, that would be great. Secondly, Carla.
So it's funny, we're such different people. I think that's why the CLGS staff is so cool. So for me, this time of COVID, in terms of the church, has been about some really practical things and worries. For me, the finances of the church, how to keep the church going, how to pay my employees, and all that. The second one, so finances is the first. The second word would be technology, and how to find a creative way to reach parishioners with worship and opportunities for prayer, and the various platforms, and trying to connect also with folks whose connection to the outside world is a landline. No cell phone, no internet. So how to stay connected and using technology for that. But I must say that the hardest one that I have two lists. One is finances, technology, and not being able to attend to those dying or those who are sick. And the hardest conversations as a priest with folks going through loss have been at times overwhelming, especially for folks who have lost dear ones and have not been able to be at their bedside. And we don't know when we will be able to bury folks. And it's funny, the way it came out in the other list was loss, survival, and creativity.
Thank you. Roland.
I would say my words are first challenging. The fact that this time has really caught us all off guard in terms of how we are to respond, not just obviously here in Southeast Michigan, but across the globe. Second, I would say grief is, I've had 4 individuals within my congregation who are at various stages of recovery with COVID. And now we're up to 6 individuals of people who have died who are related to members of the church. I would echo what Carla shared about simply being present for people. And if we have time out to kind of tell a very challenging story of being at someone who died at a nursing home, and they're calling me over to be with the family. And it's any case, having to be there and thinking that I was going to be exposed, and it was quite the adventure. But the last word I would say is opportunity, and that again coincides with the whole technology piece. My congregation and I, my board of directors and my deacons, we recognize that we have seen actually an uptick of attendance in our virtual worship. Giving has increased, and even ministering to people who aren't able to travel to get to our church normally are finding us and seeking us out online. So it has really added to a lot of great opportunity.
Thank you, all 3. So this next question, so our panelists do not know the other questions. It was just that first one. I'm proud of the fact that we have Pacific School of Religion graduates among our three and a CDSP graduate. So the GTU is well represented in our three panelists. And here's my question. It has a couple levels, so let me just say all of it and then you can see what you think of it. Since we have a good number of student seminarians on the webinar today, I'm curious to know at this moment, how do you see your seminary experience having prepared you for ministry in a time such as this, to riff off our title? And so that's the first part of it. Let me put a second part in there. No educational program or seminary can possibly prepare its students for every situation they will face in their lives. Having said that, what do you wish might have been included in your seminary education or experience that might have, if maybe the word isn't prepare you, but provided you with something more for something none of us saw coming, right? We haven't had a pandemic like this, particularly for quite a while. So first part is, how did your seminary education prepare you for ministry in this time? And what do you wish might have been included? And a connection to that would be, what might seminarians be able to look out for today as they're in the midst of their learning?
I'll jump in. When I heard that question, I saw a meme on Facebook of Leonard McCoy, who played Bones in Star Trek, and it said, you know, damn it, Jim, I'm a pastor, not a videographer. And no one, and I think no seminary could really prepare you for times that we find ourselves in. And in fact, the thing that I'm most concerned for are my other colleagues of smaller congregations. Here in Detroit, there are quite a few storefront churches that with an older pastor and older congregants, and they're simply not meeting. You know, they're not doing anything by video, telephone, they're just not meeting. And thus, the offerings, you know, really have not been coming in as well. So again, you know, the whole thing around technology, I guess one of the things that we're going to have to, as you know, theological education, is to talk more about technological advances and how to do your Bible studies online, how to connect with parishioners who are not connected, you know, with a cell phone or computer and so forth. We have just a small number of those people who are not connected that my deacons have done a spectacular job outreaching to them. But I would say many of us have had a very sharp learning curve when it's come to learning technology, learning Zoom, Facebook and so forth and the like. But because we have now engaged in this technology, I don't see us letting it go and going back to the way things were.
Thank you, Roland.
I would add that in seminary, I think a good theological education would let you immediately understand what are the basics that need to be covered in a time of disaster. And then once you know that, is strategies to build upon them. But I think it strips away, this has stripped away just layers of things that aren't necessary. And you know, it's about community, it's about connectedness, and how then do we achieve it? And I agree with Roland. I cannot envision going back to church and not recording worship and making worship available outside of the church walls going forward, and using all of these various platforms. So I think seminary education is going to need to find a happy medium again, to try to teach the class that nobody ever learns in seminary, administration and all those kinds of nuts and bolts. But I cannot imagine church not having very present technology moving forward.
Thank you, Carla.
I would say that PSR prepared me well in always looking at how power and privilege impact us in dealing with a crisis or a disaster. One of the ways, though, that so many of us have learned how to deal with these kinds of situations is to show up and to gather. It makes me think of a few years ago when my community was really impacted by the Pulse massacre, that it was all about showing up and being present and being with people and hugging people and holding hands, and all of those skills I haven't been able to utilize in this, which has been extra challenging. One thing that I think I would benefit from if I had seminary to do all over again is some more training on boundaries. I found that some of the hardest aspects of this have been setting and maintaining boundaries, not just for myself, but for my congregation. For instance, in a church where we have many volunteers who are very involved, and I'm so grateful for all of the volunteers that show up, we have about 20 people who have keys to the church. And instituting rules in which they can't enter the church has been a very hard boundary to set, and to be very firm with people that I love that you want to help, but we have to really regulate who can come in. And then boundaries on my own time. I will admit that that yesterday was the first day I took off in 2 months. So, and these have been long days. So the realization that taking time and protecting my own boundaries, that would have been one that I would have liked to have gotten a little bit more training on in seminary.
Thank you, Jacob. Another question for the three of you, and you've made mention of it in your comments already, but what does pastoral care look like? And I'm thinking of both the one-on-one visits that priests and ministers and pastors do. And if you want to go and talk about how does one offer pastoral care to the sick and to the dying in this time, and to the grieving.
I should speak if I unmuted myself. I think there is a particular model of pastoral care that we think of. You know, we have our books on pastoral care and how to look at people and how you sit and how you provide all this wisdom and care and concern for others that we have. But you know, that's gone. I have had to you know, we think we want to, you know, say nice things when folks are grieving, and but being with folks right now and saying, no, it really sucks. This really, really sucks. Because I cannot imagine having to wait 4 months now for some people for the remains of their loved ones, that they were not able to be at their bedside. I cannot imagine not being able to bury somebody on your own schedule, and having to wait and make decisions about, once we're able to open, do we want a small funeral because it would be sooner, or do we want a larger celebration of life when we can gather a larger group of people? And talking through that with folks, or seeing folks having to have a parishioner whose father is has been in the hospital almost 5 weeks now, and they've grieved. They're going through all the stages over and over and over again as the situation changes day by day. And they themselves are not in the same place as a family. So those are things that, you know, I think being real with folks and acknowledging how, not just the unusual nature of it, but the sucky part of it, that it just really is awful, 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 awful. And hold on to that with them.
Thank you, Carla.
I'll jump in. I would also say that the benefit of this being a global pandemic, most of my congregation understand that, you know, we can't come and physically be present with you and provide you the care that you have been accustomed to, because most of us have been glued to our televisions and seeing the death rates go on and on. But I also want to say a word about not just pastoral care, but again, that self-care, and to ring the bell that Jakob talked about boundaries, because I'm learning how to maintain my own boundaries as I'm providing pastoral care with folks. I alluded earlier in this call that I had a family whose mother died at a nursing home, and they wanted me to come over. And I said, well, you know, there was a patio out back, you know, so I was like, I can't go inside, but I can be at the patio. And I said, okay, fine. And I get there, and the whole family comes out on the patio with me, and they want to join hands and they want to pray. And it occurred to me that some people really don't watch the news, and so thus the gravity of social distancing, some people just don't have, and it's not because they're not intelligent, it's just, they're just disconnected, even in a time and a day such as this. And so I think if I had to live that over again, I would have just been more true to the pastoral, to the social distancing and saying, God bless you, I can't come, but I am with you. But again, it's tough because I was there. This is the fourth family member they've lost in the last year and a half. And so when the mother died, you know, it was natural for them to call, and it was natural for me to show up, but, you know, to protect myself and those in my own household, you know, I just can't do that. And so, yes, doing pastoral care differently is something that I need to be more wary of, and just, you know, and to help teach others that we still care for them, even though we're not together.
Thank you, Roland.
I would also just add to that grief now looks so different than it did just a short time ago. No matter why people are grieving, whether it's a COVID death or another kind of death, it just looks different, and pastoral care looks so different right now. And I think we're all learning.
Thank you, Jakob. This question's not easy and maybe too big, but see what you think of it. Have you witnessed, and if so, how, privilege and power functioning in new ways and challenging you at this time? And I'm thinking particularly here of racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia. So that's huge. And if any of that part of that question resonates, yeah.
I'm gonna stick to the practical stuff. That I think it's become, the inequalities in New York City has just become unavoidable to notice. But Bernie described our congregation as a inclusive, multicultural, and bilingual congregation, and we are a poor congregation, congregants are, but our church is wealthy. We have an endowment. But the moment in which I felt our privilege and is those darn PPP loans, SBA loans, and the difference between the fact that us as a church can use a payroll service who figured it out for us, and we filled out an application in 30 minutes. And that got the church lifeline, because we are losing income for this time. But the difference, it was solely that we are wealthy enough as a parish that we are able to do payroll through a payroll service, and that is like so ridiculous. It's just ridiculous that it comes down to that, and folks who have given, and it's not my business. I mean, the church, I love my church, but it's not my entity, it's not my sweat that built it, and that other entities in which people have put in their heart and soul and invested in it, in our poorer neighborhoods, are run by people of color, our barbershops, so many small businesses, like 3 employees, 2 employees, 1 employee, that the difference is in access to quick help to figure some of these financial things. And that to me was just a dramatic inequality. And it just highlights, they'll do a study in terms of which churches were able to do the PPP loan and which didn't, and all this kind of thing. And that is going to reveal on one issue, on one thing, just gross inequalities denominationally and parish-wise.
Thank you, Carla. Okay, another question. Jacob, did you want to say something? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I would say that the access to healthcare as well is an issue, and the reality that new legislation is being slipped through the cracks at this time, particularly around trans folks. And there's an inherent distrust in many trans people towards medical care in general. So the reality of needing to get health care and not being able to have an advocate with you, one of the things that, again, it's like how we've always been taught to just show up. One of the things that I think is so important is myself as a clergy person, or anyone who advocates for other people, if someone needs to get health care and they are in some way marginalized and are scared that they won't get quality care because of who they are, having someone else there makes all the difference. And it being in a situation where absolutely nobody can be there with them. It's been proven, there have been studies that trans people tend to delay getting care out of that fear. And of course, in a variety of marginalized spaces, it impacts in other ways. But I would say that that's one of the heavier burdens right now.
And I want to chime in as well. Again, another meme I saw on Facebook that we all are in the same storm, but we are in different boats. And it just really highlights, again, just the experience for many people during this time. It's like it's nothing. Our state is reopening, and we can go get a tattoo if we want to. And others, people are literally dying daily. and you face it and you feel it. But one of the things I just wanted to mention in response to your question is my husband is the executive director of a homeless youth shelter here in Southeast Michigan called the Ruth Ellis Center. And many people have asked, well, how are the young people doing during this time? And very surprisingly, they're doing okay because they pretty much know what it is like to live without a place to call home, or not to have a support system, and to live with anxiety and fear and who's around you all the time. So this whole pandemic that we find ourselves in really is almost business as normal and usual for them. And so I shared that with my congregation and other people as I talk to them, to let them know that we are now understanding and seeing life the way that many of these young people do, who are, youth of color, homeless, transient, and how is it that we can connect more so with our common humanity. And I just feel like this pandemic is really revealing the cracks in our system and revealing who we really are as a people and as a nation. And I really do hope we can continue to grow to be better.
Thank you, all three of you. This next question, feel free to pass on, because I realize it gets personal. Not that these questions haven't related to your own personal lives, but what have you learned about yourself as a Christian priest, minister, pastor during this time?
Waiting for my colleagues to jump in. I would say for myself, it is revealed for me just really my faith in God in all of this. Seeing people who are outside of the church or outside of religious circles, and how they are dealing with this, either very casually, you can tell they didn't care about people before and they don't care about people now, or they're just riddled with fear and anxiety. And I have a lot of people in my congregation who live with anxiety, clinical, anxiety. And so, and it's easy for me to be frozen and just sit in front of the television watching the news, ad nauseum. But I recognize that my call is to this community, not just those who worship in my space, but the entire community, and to be that presence of hope and faith, and that we are going to move forward through this. And so that has really kind of surprised me, that I've been able to encourage myself and to say, yeah, my faith is really deep, in that regard, that I'm not really as shaken as I thought I might be, or want to withdraw as much as I would like to, be an introvert. But my call has me still to move forward and move out.
Thank you.
I did my field education when I was at GTU at West Contra Costa County Jail on Point Richmond. And when I would meet with folks, I had to come to terms with the fact that I wasn't a lawyer or a social worker or a CO, or I wasn't many things. I was just a chaplain. And I wasn't gonna know where their kids were or the dog, or, I just had no information whatsoever except I could pray with you. And that's a huge lesson then. And I think I'm reminded of it now, that in the midst of all that I cannot do, then focus on what you can. And even if those are really basic and seem simple, that those matter as well. And not focus on all of the things that I'm not able to do. right now, but focus on the ones that I am able to do, and do them well, and recognize what I am in this context and what I am not.
Thank you, Carla.
This time is so challenging for so many reasons, and in some ways I feel like I've been become more empowered in my pastoral identity, partly just by noticing that how much I have stepped into my own role as pastor. I've been the pastor of my church for almost 5 years, and at the same time holding all of my other identities as a husband, as a father. I've got twin teenagers who are seniors in high school and missing all of the major milestones that come at the end of your senior year, and just the incredible amount of grief that I have on behalf of my kids who are actually dealing with it incredibly well. So holding all of those realities and those identities at the same time has in some ways helped me just connect more to my own pastoral voice. I think struggling with perfectionism and always wanting things to be perfect, and then learning how to preach to an empty room every week has been a real challenge. And as someone mentioned earlier, I'm not a trained videographer. I'm not trained in any of these technology things. And so it's like this learning curve of learning how to do your best and admit that your best might not be, that my best might not be up to the standard that I would like. And just keep on going.
Thank you, Jacob.
And Bernie, I want to jump in one more time to, I've had a little bit more time to reflect, because the pandemic obviously was hit us during the time of, Holy Week and Easter and resurrection, and just, in terms of even how it has impacted my personal faith. Reading those texts and understanding the symbolisms of the season, really, I had to look at it differently than I ever had before, because I had to then interpret that for my congregation. And the key thing about resurrection is that it's about the losing of fear of death, and that you can continue to move forward despite your circumstances that are around you. And so that is the thing that I have personally embodied, and what I'm currently teaching to my congregation, is to say, what does it mean for us to still be here in Southeast Michigan with death all around us? But what does it mean that we're going to be resurrection people, to lose that fear and to continue to do all the things that God is calling us to do and as a community? So that's big right now for us. And I know we're going to be living and embodying that for quite some time.
Thank you.
I also came to a totally new understanding of resurrection, and really came to know Lent and Holy Week and Easter in a new way. With Easter had always been the culmination of the event, and then we have Easter and yay, he's risen, and suddenly we start talking about resurrection and realize all these other pieces of resurrection that in the typical Sunday after Easter sermon on Thomas, as often falls into the lectionary. I felt so connected to Thomas in a new way, with the doubt, but also the intense need that Thomas had to literally feel Jesus's wounds. And what does it mean to us as a traumatized people living into our faith and connecting with Jesus through the woundedness, instead of just, isn't it great, Easter has come, everyone got to wear their nice clothes and look for eggs outside, and suddenly Easter has a completely new meaning.
Thank you, everyone. At this point, we'll move into questions, and if you would put them in the chat box, I won't be able to scroll up, but I just wanted to make mention of the fact that in our three presenters here, I mean, you can see the privilege I have of working with Carla and Roland and Jakob. Among these three, we have seminary professors, organizers, totally cool. We have two MCC pastors, a special connection between MCC and PSR. And so I'm really thrilled that we could come together and have this conversation. So at this point, if you have a question you'd like to pose to the panel, if you would put it in the group chat, and then I'll call out some of those questions in our remaining 15 minutes or so.
While a question pops up, I'm just going to say something funny. Roland, the fear resurrection thing is speaking to me right now. Is we were so worried about Easter not happening, and we forgot that Easter wasn't about us, so letting go of that was pretty cool.
I have a question here. So what signs of hope do you see in this pandemic? That is, how might ministry find new ways of building the reign of God in our world today?
What comes to mind is the connection to even the whole power and privilege that you alluded to earlier, because we clearly have been a society that has lived in silos, and as I alluded to earlier, many of our experiences, even now, are different from others. But to me, I think it's a very callous person to only see just still your narrow focus and narrow community, that the hope really could and should be to connect us more so to the lived everyday experiences of others who are out there, those who have to ride the public bus and they have no other choice, or when the public bus system stopped, here in Detroit, and how everyone was, put out. Like, how does that impact you, even though you may not ride the bus? How does that impact you? And I just really feel that hope is still something that it may rise like the rising sun, but it's also something you need to really pursue and to really go after, particularly in times that are just dark and scary, to know that I can't remain here. And even though I might be riddled with anxiety, I have to have someone help me, pull me out, or I need to find the strength to move towards that. And so that's what I feel, we're doing here in the Detroit area. So.
Thank you, Roland.
I think a place where I find hope, or I'm looking forward to finding hope in, is once our feeding program can restart. The needs that we have to safely do a feeding program will restart, and that where it's hopeful already is that a bunch of people have stepped up and might be leaders in it, and take it to new levels. So everything that existed will be renewed and transformed by this, and that's to me very hopeful.
We created a little online form where congregants could fill out if they needed food, but they could also on this form fill out if they wanted to help by purchasing food or delivering food to people. And pretty much for every one request for assistance, we had 2 to 3 people offering to help. And seeing people who are thirsty to help has been really wonderful. Another place that I feel a lot of hope is in what comes next for the church. It'll look different. There's, we keep hearing that phrase, a new normal, and that is definitely what all of us will face. We had already had in place a plan to bring on an assistant pastor. I've been a solo pastor the whole time I've been at my church. And so we had a plan in place already to bring in an assistant pastor in August, and he offered graciously to start as volunteer clergy now when there was a big need. And we've been able to increase our programming, and where we used to offer a class on a Thursday night and we'd get maybe 6 people, we're having 20 to 25 people come into these Zoom classes that we've created on what does the Bible say about LGBT people, where is God in this pandemic. We have an evening prayer service that we hadn't had before that we also do on Zoom. And I'm feeling really hopeful in the renewed need for church and the renewed connection to our community. And like Roland said, it's not, when I say my community, I don't mean the people who previously have been worshiping in my building, although that is definitely a huge part of my community. I mean a community in a broader sense, and really feeling a connection to invite a broad invitation to be able to connect with other people.
Thank you, Jacob. Here's a question, thank you, from Jojo. Bishop Yvette Flunder has said that we must rethink and redefine religion. For example, with Christianity, redefining it as relationship. Regarding this, how can we, as Christians, be in relationship with one another if we have to be so concerned about boundaries? Thinking maybe that means physical boundaries and maybe more.
I think that there's that phrase that we've had of meet people where they're at. And we usually think about that as meet people where they are in their faith journey. I think that right now in these times, depending on the comfort level of folks, especially some of my older parishioners, like we'll be able to literally meet people where they're at through technology. So the church is bursting through the walls into broader community, and I think that hopefully that will remain after we are in live worship again.
Thank you, Carla. We have a few minutes left. Just a note that at the conclusion of today's webinar at 2 o'clock here, California time, David Vasquez-Levy, our president, will be staying on for the usual weekly lectionary reflections. So please stay on for that. And let me see if we can take one more question. I'm scrolling through here. Oh, here's an interesting one. So do any of you want to say a word about what you plan to preach about this Sunday? Maybe it's too early on Tuesday, I don't know.
Well, actually, to be honest with you, I'm now recording my messages on Tuesday. So it's worked out well that I'm in my clerical gear, because then I'll do my sermon after, because my admin then edits it and puts it on YouTube. It's Mother's Day. And so, really focusing on, and the scripture that in the lectionary, talks about, Christ being rejected and, now being the cornerstone and so forth. And so I connected it with the need, we all know how it feels to be rejected, but the need to have that embrace, of a parent's love and care and concern. And so using that as a launch pad to continue to do this work in the community, that a parent completely understands what we're thinking and feeling and going through, and is there as our major cheerleader. So, and talking about the motherhood and all the various entities in which it shows up.
Thank you, Roland. What I'd like to do before we end, unless Jakob or Carla want to jump in on that, is just share my screen here a bit to let you know that, see if I can do this efficiently here, that this Thursday, same place, same time, our Jewish Queries series will have a really, I think, fascinating discussion on listening to the heart, what Jewish texts say about reparation, and see if I can move my screen here. So we have 3 folks, Tamara Fish, Megan, Pamela, Ruth Madison, and Hazan Sabrina Sojourner, who will be speaking about African-American reparations from the context of Jewish sacred texts. And then on May 12th, our next Lavender Lunch is a week from today, which will be at 12:10. And one of PSR's own students, Brant Miller, will be talking about their experience as a filmmaker in queer communities in Mongolia. And then I've been asked to make a brief mention too, to spread the word. Let me reshare my screen here to let you know that the Certificate of Sexuality and Religion, which is a program that all of our panelists, I believe, have taught in, it will be available fully online via distance learning beginning next fall. It also is possible to do the CSR in one year, so that's kind of exciting. So we draw to a close now. Again, please stay on if you would like to engage in some lectionary reflections. Maybe if you're preparing to preach this Sunday, you can stay on and hear some ideas. Teasing. And yes, do contact admissions at PSR if you'd like any more questions. So I would like to say thank you to Carla, to Jakob, and to Roland, not only for your time here today, but for your ministry, and happy season of Easter. So please stay on if you'd like to engage with David with some lectionary reflections. And thank you for attending this PSR webinar, CLGS Lavender Lunch. Hope to see many of you this Thursday for our Jewish Queries series at 1 p.m. here on Zoom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you, Jakob, Carla, and Roland, for a remarkable conversation, for your deep compassion, presence, and agency in the communities where you served, and for your vulnerability in sharing with us as well. It is really a gift to be part of such a rich community within CLGS and PSR. So thank you all for joining us for this webinar and Lavender Lunch. You know, I invite you, I'll take a second here and we'll just share a few thoughts on the lectionary readings for this coming Sunday, and invite your thoughts as well, for those of you who are able to remain for a few minutes with us for that. And we'll keep that to about 10 minutes, just a really brief time of reflection together. So again, my name is David Vasquez-Levy. I serve as president here at PSR. We've been doing a little bit of reflections on the common lectionary readings for each Sunday, recognizing that not everyone necessarily uses those texts, but as a way to gather our community in reflection. And so hopefully some of the comments here may spark ideas for you that you can also, as Bernie invited, would love to have you share into the chat any of the thinking that you are doing on either these texts or others as you prepare for sharing the word, those of you who will on Sunday that may be preaching. So the two readings I want to kind of focus a little bit on are the First Peter reading. For those in the chat, First Peter chapter 2, verses 2 through 10 is one of the readings for Sunday, and I'll focus on two verses there for just a few reflections, and then also John 14, which is the gospel for this Sunday, and already some reference has been made to the way that the texts are really speaking in some phenomenal ways to this moment that we are living with. As earlier today, I think Jakob had indicated or Carla, about how we are revisiting these texts in ways that are unprecedented. I've thought about the text of the disciples being behind closed doors afraid, as really this is the closest our communities have been to the original Easter, both by the sense of fear that surrounded the early community, but also by that sense of uncertainty, disappointment, grief that the disciples experienced as they walked away from Jerusalem in the Emmaus walk last week. Well, we are living in the middle of that as well. What I want to invite us to consider as we engage the text is the fact that those moments of real intensity, those watershed moments like those experienced by the early disciples and the early faith community, the early Christian community around the event of Christ's life, also highlight some of the tensions that come in watershed moments. And our texts, rich and valuable as they are, they also carry with them some of the real tensions that I think is important we find ways to address with our communities. Because references to the Jews that are done in these texts that can be taken out of context, as they have throughout the history of the Christian community, to create a blaming of one group over the other. So this text provides us an opportunity to think about the ways that a moment like this and its anxieties can at times turn communities in against each other, as it happened for the early Christian community as it began to feel more tension within it. Then that tension, that internal tension, was interpreted externally in ways that became very problematic and have been very problematic over the history of the Christian church. But also, what do we learn about that, about the fact that this moment is currently also being used in very similar ways to create fear of others, that the fear we share of an imperial force, as it was the case for the Roman Empire suppressing the people who lived in that region, all of a sudden gets turned within the community as it divides along ideological understandings of this crisis or this moment that they are living through. So how do we understand, even from the very witness of our text, about a different way of engaging at a time of high tension, and then call out the ways that currently those in power are using the stereotyping, the scapegoating of immigrants, of other countries, of fear in ways that pandemic after pandemic, crisis after crisis, those in power have sought to do. So how do we call that out and recognize that we have a different way of being that is invited in the text? In the First Peter text, there is this, Roland referred clearly to the image of this text in verse 2:4, where it says, "Come to Christ, come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight." Think about the way that we have completely changed what is central and important, what is essential work. What we have often thought of as disposable work becomes now essential work. The work of meat packers in plants, it becomes so essential that their very life is required to put at stake. The tension we need to name and engage with is that those very workers, most of them undocumented, are also at the same time being villainized and spoken of as the enemy. So how do we wrestle with that tension? But what the text invites us to do is to think about how the event of Christ's life, the Smith that we gather around and celebrate and place into this pivot moment of of this time of spring, invites us to think about the reversal of what's important and what's valuable. What was this living stone, what was rejected, becomes central in God's sight. And then we are invited to build with those stones. So what will it mean for us not only to pray for and celebrate and recognize those who are frontline workers right now, those essential workers, but to actually build the church literally, with these lives, with this work, our own as well, as many of us may be part of those frontline workers. So how do we see ourselves as part of this larger whole, the spiritual house that we get to build, a new community, a new way of being? And what will the agency of the church be? How do we balance the need to be present to the grief and the moment and to tend to it, but also to speak about the image of the building of a new way of being in the world, built from precisely these stones that have previously been rejected? To see ourselves even as this holy priesthood. What does that mean? For the church to really see itself in its neighborhood. I appreciated earlier the comments and conversation that Roland said of thinking about church, and this is forcing us to think beyond those who gather in our space to a much broader understanding of what it means to be this holy priesthood, this salt that gives meaning and flavor and adds to the presence of the world, of God in the world. To turn briefly to the text from the Gospel of John, chapter 14, begins with the powerful words, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me." This text is often used at funerals, and in many ways, as we recognize, we are absent from the funerals of loved ones. I've had a number of deaths in my community, our neighbor, my wife's uncle, and others in our family who have passed away over this season. And it's been extremely difficult to be absent from those communities. How do we hear in the communities that gather on Zoom and in other ways these words of affirmation in the midst of what is truly devastating and grief and death? But also, again, the text invites us to not just dwell on that grief, but to dare to move beyond it, not to minimize it in any way, but to acknowledge it. And in that role, I just love the image of Thomas. I appreciated Jacob's earlier comment, I think it was Jacob, who reminded us of how Thomas needed to touch Jesus. He named this very physical, guttural need. In the text for this week from John 14, Thomas again does the same thing. He invites us to ask the tough questions. When we think about our youth, our young people in our communities and in our congregations, where is the space for the questions they are raising? How are we creating that space within the church and within our worshiping community for those questions to be invited? Might we do that during a sermon? During not just invite prayers, but invite the questions people are wrestling with. What I particularly appreciate in John 14 is that in a way, Jesus is waxing poetic about the place that Jesus will go to prepare a place. There's this powerful image of the kingdom as a place that has a room for everyone. What a wonderful image. In an odd way, is an image of Zoom with little windows, but more so, it's a communal image, and it's wonderful. But Thomas has the courage to say, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" This is a powerful naming of the uncertainty and lack of clarity. Had he not dared to speak his question out loud, we may not have received Jesus's response that articulates, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." There I want to leave us with one more just caveat or context to think about. Jesus says that very powerful statement, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," to a group of people who are afraid, who are powerless. And Jesus says to them that it is God who is the way. It is God who invites people into community, into new life. It is spoken to a group that is afraid and powerless in many respects. It is a marginal group that is hearing this. And it's a statement against empire, against the Romans. Because if you remember, the Roman Empire was known because all roads lead to Rome. Their power was exercised by the creation of roads. So it's a political statement Jesus is making when he says, it is God who is the way, the truth, and the life, not the empire. So how do we raise questions about our strugglings of faith, about the inequalities in the society, about the decisions being made on our behalf by our government, and create space for those to be heard? But the caveat or the context is to realize that at times the Christian community has used that very text, to return full circle to where I started, has used that text to claim not that God makes that absolute claim against the empire, but as the Christian community and other faith communities have had more of a place, and in fact at times been the empire, we have heard and understood that text in authoritarian terms. We have seen ourselves not as the ones against whom the critique or the demand is made by God to claim full authority. We have wanted to do that. We have wanted to put the booths at the access points to the highway, to the road, so that we can charge admission or determine that it is through us, through our particular faith communities, that this access to the way, the truth, of the life comes in. I hope that's making some sense. I think that reversal here, which is being pressed by this experience of a truly breaking down, decentralizing of what it means to be church, that we may hear in this text an invitation to recognize that ultimately we are indeed, as the old song says, the whole world is in God's hands. So thank you for your time to be a part of this conversation. Thank you for comments and other things that have been contributed. Sorry that reflections today are a little bit shorter. I hope you will join us again next week, and may you be blessed in your life, your work, your ministry, and thank you for being part of our conversation today. Have a great afternoon and join us again for our various upcoming events.